Today, we're going to get into the origin story of Max Weber, who is without a doubt one of the founding fathers of sociology. See, to really get a handle on his world-changing ideas, you first have to understand the man himself, and the pretty intense world that created him. So let me start with a big question, one that was right at the heart of everything Weber thought about. What is it that really drives modern life? Is it all about cold, hard cash and economic forces? Or is there something else, something deeper, like our values, our beliefs, our ethics, that's actually pulling the strings? And what's so incredible about Weber is that for him, this wasn't just some abstract academic debate. No, he was convinced that the answer to this giant question could be found in the deeply personal and, frankly, painful conflict that was tearing his own family apart. And that brings us right to the heart of his early years. This was a conflict that would basically become the engine for his entire life's work. Okay, so just picture this household. It was a war zone of ideas. On one side, you have his father. He was a successful politician, a man who loved the good life, enjoyed his success, and basically ruled the family with an iron fist. On the other side, you have his mother. She was a deeply religious Calvinist, committed to a life of hard work, strict morality, and self-denial. These two people, these two worldviews, they were like oil and water, completely incompatible. I mean, Weber's father was the definition of a patriarch. He couldn't stand anyone disagreeing with him, and he controlled his wife's every move. He really represented this world of worldly success, of power and material pleasure. And then, in total contrast, you have his mother. Her life was this constant inward struggle, all driven by her faith. She represented a completely different world, one of spiritual duty, self-denial, and a deep moral conscience. Her reality wasn't about what she had, but about her standing before God. So you can imagine young Max Weber was caught right in the middle, feeling like he had to pick a side, his father's materialism or his mother's faith. And this choice, it wasn't easy. It was a source of real emotional agony for him his whole life. In fact, a lot of people argue his entire career as a sociologist was really just an attempt to figure out and resolve this conflict that started at his own dinner table. Well, all that inner tension, it just kept building and building until it finally led to a devastating breaking point. It was a personal crisis that, paradoxically, set the stage for his greatest intellectual achievements. You know, even before his complete collapse, Weber was a man living under an incredible amount of pressure. He was a chronic overworker. We're talking producing 3 massive books while also working full-time as a lawyer. He lived this incredibly disciplined life, strictly regulated by the clock, basically channeling that same Protestant work ethic he got from his mother, the very thing he'd later become famous for analyzing. And then it all just fell apart. In 1897, he finally snaps and has a huge, violent fight with his father over how he was treating his mother. Just a few weeks later, his father suddenly dies, and they never got the chance to reconcile. The guilt, the stress, it was too much. It triggered a complete nervous breakdown that left him totally unable to work for more than 5 years. He really went through an abyss. But when he finally emerged from that darkness in 1903, what's the very first major thing he writes? The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And that is absolutely not a coincidence. In this single book, he tackles all the themes that haunted him his whole life: religion, capitalism, and the deep-seated values that make people do what they do. It was his intellectual rebirth. Now, to build this new sociology of his, Weber first had to deal with the biggest intellectual giant in the room, Karl Marx. And while he didn't always mention him by name, Weber was constantly in this sort of silent dialogue with the ghost of Marx, pushing back against his most fundamental ideas. Their first big disagreement was about the whole point of science. For Marx, science and revolution were linked. A theory was true if it got people to act. But Weber, he totally rejected that. He argued that sociology had to be value-free. It should be an objective search for the truth about what is, and we have to be super careful not to mix that up with our own opinions about what ought to be. Next up, history. Marx saw history as this predictable train moving on a single track. It followed inevitable laws, right? Capitalism would automatically lead to communism. But Weber saw things very differently. For him, history was way more chaotic, more like a series of chance events. He argued that capitalism wasn't inevitable at all. It just happened to pop up in the West because of a very specific and kind of accidental mix of factors. And that brings us to their most famous fight, economic determinism. For Marx, the economy is everything. The substructure, who owns the factories, determines all of society. Politics, culture, religion, it's all just a reflection of economics. But Weber, really channeling his mother's side of the family argument, came back with a powerful counterpunch. He argued that ideas, especially religious beliefs and moral convictions, could be every bit as powerful as economic interests. Sometimes our beliefs actually shape our economic reality, not the other way around. And Weber himself just puts it perfectly here. He called the idea that politics is just a reflection of economics a delusion. He thought people were completely overestimating the economic factor. For Weber, culture and ideas weren't some sideshow. They were a driving force in history. So, after taking on Marx, Weber's next move was to build his own, unique way of doing sociology. He basically created a whole new toolkit for understanding our social world. He jumped right into this huge debate happening in German economics at the time called the Methodenstreit, which just means method dispute. And it was basically a big fight between two camps. One side said, you have to focus on all the messy, concrete details of history to find truth. The other side said, no, you need big, abstract, universal theories to explain things. So it was the specific versus the general. And what did Weber do? In a move of pure genius, he refused to choose. He took the best ideas from both sides and blended them into his own powerful approach. First, he borrowed this concept called Verstehen, which is just German for understanding. He said, look, if you want to explain why people do things, you can't just watch them from a distance like they're ants. You have to try to understand the subjective meaning they themselves give to their actions. What was going through their head? Why did they think they were doing it? Next, he brought in this idea of value relevance. This helped solve a really tough problem. Weber was honest. He said, of course, our personal values and our culture are going to influence what we decide to study. We research things we think are important. But, and this is the key part, once we've picked our topic, the actual research has to be completely objective and value-free. And this brings us to his most brilliant tool, the ideal type. Now, ideal here doesn't mean perfect or the best. It's more like a pure conceptual model. Think of it like a perfect blueprint of something, say a bureaucracy. This blueprint captures all the essential features. Of course, no bureaucracy in the real world will perfectly match the blueprint, but that's the point. You can use this ideal type as a measuring stick to see how real-world examples compare and what makes them unique. It's an incredibly clever way to study a messy social world. So after this whole incredible journey, born from family conflict, forged in personal crises, and sharpened in huge intellectual debates, what was Weber's final verdict? What was his diagnosis of the modern world he saw taking shape all around him? He called it the iron cage. Weber had this deep fear that the very things that made the modern world possible, rationality, efficiency, bureaucracy, would eventually end up trapping us. That we'd become cogs in a massive machine, locked in systems of control that would slowly strip life of its deeper meaning and crush our individual freedom. It's a really haunting and powerful idea. And that's what Weber leaves us with. It's a question that feels even more relevant today than it did 100 years ago. As we live more and more of our lives guided by algorithms, by metrics, by huge, faceless systems, you have to stop and ask, are we living in a rational iron cage that we ourselves have built?